If you're interested in decoding the complexities of China's national security outlook and its military modernization, check out Takshashila's latest expert capsule course offering China's Defense in the New Era. Visit school.takshashila.org.in and enroll in the course today.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. This is Swathi, Kalyani, your host, geospatial research analyst with the Takshashila Institution. And today I have with me Shobhankita Reddy, research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics. Hi Shobhankita.
Hi Swathi.
So today we are going to discuss about the recent Nobel Prize awarded in the field of economics. The citation or the major theme which was awarded was titled for having explained innovation-driven economic growth. The awardees were Mokyr and Phillipe Aghion and Peter Howitt. So let's discuss about what their topic was about and its relevance in today's times. To start with, can you give a brief about these winners and what was the big idea that they were recognized for?
Yeah, thanks, Swathi. So 3 scholars who have been awarded the Economics Nobel Prize 2025, like you were saying, Mokyr, Phillipe Aghion, and Peter Howitt. And their work actually fits together quite well. Mokyr is the professor of Northwestern and Tel Aviv University. Phillipe Aghion has professorships at College of France, INSEAD in Paris, and the London School of Economics. And Peter Howitt is a professor at Brown University. And they have combinedly won 11 million Swedish kroner, divided half of it to Mokyr and the remaining half jointly for Phillipe Aghion and Peter Howitt. So the foundational question that these scholars have tried to answer is this. Between 1300 to 1680, prior to the Industrial Revolution, we have had a whole range of technology advancements, the printing press, windmills, etc. and etc. However, England's GDP per person was stubbornly flat. And if you see prior to the Industrial Revolution, almost for millennia, we have had short bursts of growth, but nothing that was sustained and that compounded over a period of time.
Okay.
However, if you see after the Industrial Revolution, in advanced economies and overall as well, we see the sustained growth even at 2%, 3%. It's a compounding curve that only linearly goes up. So what happened prior and what has changed after? That despite technology advancements, innovation prior to these bursts that didn't actually sustain and compound, but post the Industrial Revolution, this transformative transition. So what really happened in the Industrial Revolution? What are the lessons from that? And that's actually the work that Mokyr has worked in. He's an economic historian. So he has worked trying to explain that. And the work of the second set of scholars actually tries to explain and model growth in modern economy, such as today, which is firm-led, how do businesses interact with each other, etc., etc. So it's both the things, right? So first is historic basis at that significant juncture around 2 centuries ago, and then what has happened since that we have had the sustained growth. And the second paper on the sustained growth actually explains that underneath this clear compounding annual rate of growth is a massive churn at the individual firm level, with multiple firms dying, with job creation and job destruction happening at a high rate. But we have this clean aggregate of 2-3% linear curve, right? So what exactly is happening underneath? So that's the transformational big question that they're trying to answer. And if you will, I can go into that in some detail.
Yeah. So elaborate about, the papers that have won this prize exactly, and what is this innovation-led growth that they try to focus on? Is it based on some models, or is this historical qualitative analysis? How do they go about it?
Yeah. So Mokyr actually has these sweeping ideas, and although his work is based in econometrics and economic data analysis, what he's actually known better for is his ideas that explain some of these transformational stuff around Industrial Revolution. For example, Renaissance Italy and the Dutch Golden Age had bursts of growth, but the transition during the Industrial Revolution has been transformative to humankind. The growth that Renaissance Italy and Dutch Golden Age, all of these had, these eventually fizzled out. And he actually has a proposition which he talks about as two kinds of knowledge. One is propositional and the other is prescriptive. So the prescriptive is the how-to and the propositional is the theoretical why, the foundation. And he has this line where he says, prior to the Industrial Revolution, we had iron making without metallurgy, medical practice without microbiology.
Right.
So we had these professions and people tinkering and building things, but they had no scientific epistemological basis to have as a foundation for when something goes wrong, and then to eventually build upon that. So what that means is people would waste their time in doing things that just theoretically were impossible. They would keep building and tinkering, but again, it was not based on, just science and the why and the theoretical basis in natural principles and the natural laws or even scientific principles. So it would fizzle out, it would be individual bursts of innovation and entrepreneurship. But again, that was not sustained because at a societal level, this knowledge didn't really diffuse and percolate. So he talks about the importance of both propositional and the prescriptive, the how and the why coming together. And this, he says, uniquely happened around 1800 during the Industrial Revolution in England specifically. So he talks about how the Enlightenment was actually about connecting these two types of knowledge. It's not about these individual great scientific theories, but it's actually the fact that technology could validate science and science could further guide technology. So it's the coupling of both.
Right.
And how did this happen? And he talks about how this happened because of scientific societies, because publications became more accessible, because public lectures happened in smaller towns. And the change itself was technological. So printing press was an invention, but it also helped disseminate these ideas freely, allowing for these ideas to spread across society much easier. And he cites also some political reasons, such as Europe's fragmentation, which allowed for scientists and innovators to travel around and decide where they wanted to settle, depending on environments that were more suitable for their work. So this positive feedback loop that happened at that point in time. Secondly, people who were tinkering, those who could build, those who could debug, people who actually did things, people who actually could make things work reliably. There is evidence to show, according to Mokyr's work, that in English counties that had lots of such people, it was actually there that the roots of the Industrial Revolution took off. So it's this coming together of the how as well as the why, the theoretical understanding as well as the putting together of these things in products and things that work. So, for example, the Lunar Society in Birmingham, the Royal Society in London, all of these were scientific societies that had these tinkerers part of them. These were not just competent places for debate, but people who understood things theoretically and practically could come together and build upon each other's knowledge base. He also works through several theories, right? So he says, what was it about this Industrial Revolution? It wasn't that colonialism was extractive. It was, but the extractive nature of colonialism can't actually explain for why innovation happened. Also, it was not demand because India and China at the time had plenty demand, but that didn't translate to innovation. It was also not Protestant work ethic. It was not that the science that came up at the time was particularly special. None of that. So his theory actually hinges upon culture. So as much as it's the coming together of these two types of knowledge, it's also about people's ability to be open to ideas, to the exchange of ideas. So these cultures where these debates and publications could be easily accessible, people could come together and discuss, like the societies that I mentioned. All of these have been very important to England in the 1800s. So his theory talks about upper tail human capital, which is about 5 to 10% of people that are between the social elites and the common worker. So this is not the social elites who just think, and this is not the common worker who probably is not even well-read.
Right.
So this is about a group of people who are highly skilled, who can do things, having that culture and incentive to innovate and to build and to contribute to technology, right? So he talks about how the son of a shipwright, a barber, people who are actually building these things, the mechanics, those that actually contributed to new developments because they understood scientific principles sufficiently enough, but at the same time, they also were able to build things reliably. So it's this coming together of two. And Mokyr's work draws on the work of Jonathan Hughes, who's written a book called The Vital Few, where he says it's not actually about abstract ideas and trends like markets and governments and so on, but it's actually individual entrepreneurs, innovators, people who do things that contribute, right? So his book actually has these vivid portraits of entrepreneurs like Carnegie and Ford and people in the social worker space, so on and so forth, who actually contributed to big change. So actually Mokyr's work does the same for 1800 Industrial Revolution England, and he puts together this piece that it's culture, it's this fragile thing in society.
Yeah.
Coming together of a broad epistemic base, the Enlightenment, the culture of experimentation, the culture of tinkering, the sufficient base for science and industrial focus, and the need for ideas to arrive and diffuse quickly that enabled industrial revolution that could break, this stagnant growth rate for actually centuries before that.
Right. So it's basically like it's also the acceptance within the society which will allow certain innovation or advancements to happen and then take forward the society itself. Also, that's very insightful also about Mokyr's work. So how does this translate into this modern economies and also the other paper about other two winners who have contributed to this?
Yeah. So the second paper actually is about creative destruction. This idea that we must have a high churn in our economy for capital, labor, and time and effort to be shifted from low productivity firms to higher productivity firms for the sustained economic growth to happen. So what that would entail, unfortunately, is firms shutting down, is people losing jobs, but that's actually a net positive overall. And today, I think this is a fairly accepted idea, at a very macro level in all our minds. But what Peter Howard and Phillipe Aghion could do is actually create a model that could neatly simulate some of these things and explain some of the incentives. And what's unique about their model is that technology is not an external variable that drops from the sky, changing things for everybody who's present. It's actually baked into the economic incentives of each player. So there's an economic incentive to pursue R&D, right? So the fact that they were able to make this variable a part of the model instead of an exogenous variable actually differentiates some of their work. So again, what's important is the fact that a society must allow old ideas and old ways of doing things to be shelved. It must have this ability to accommodate new ideas, entrepreneurs who are coming up with new ways of doing things and disrupting the old. And the key insight here is that technological change is actually political. If a group with enough power to stop change is allowed to do so, actually everybody else suffers. Right? So there's an importance for institutions, for policy to chime in and actually ensure that this doesn't happen, because net society and net progress actually declines at the interest of a vested few who happen to be incumbents. So their model actually has all of these things baked in: existing incumbents, new players, economic incentive to innovate modeled in a way that's clean and neat and groundbreaking and pioneering. So, for example, they say almost a very, very high churn. 10% of all firms in the US enter or exit in a given year. And that's a good thing overall, because US has been the most innovative of societies, for the last many, many decades. So that's one, right? So firm exit rates, job destruction actually has a high correlation to overall labor productivity. And in fact, a quarter to half of productivity growth actually comes from this shift. So that's another key insight, right? That ideas are non-rivalrous. The fact that knowledge spillovers are a real thing. But at the same time, there are ways in which this affects incumbents and new players.
Okay, so how does this interplay? Like, how do these knowledge disruptions or these competitions within the regions or economies itself overplay throughout the economic future of a country, or how does the development get influenced by this?
Yeah. So, firstly, a key insight is that incumbents in general have less incentive to innovate. because why would they, right? I mean, it's incremental profit margins for them for very high R&D investments. So why would they cannibalize their own existing products and profits by innovating and looking for just an incremental growth, right? So it's not incompetence on the part of incumbents, but it's just their incentive that they would not want to invest in new product lines. So it actually makes sense for newer players, newer entrepreneurs, newer ways of doing things to come from outside rather than the incumbents.
Right.
So that's the first thing, right? But what can happen is if we have multiple of these external players trying to take upon or challenge an incumbent, what that means is each of them can be investing in their own R&D, and that can be wasteful spending.
Okay, it would be like similar research happening with multiple.
Correct.
Yeah,
So that's one problem, right? In the sense that this is wasteful spending, wasteful investment, all for the same product line, same sector, etc. Right? So that's first. Secondly, there are knowledge spillovers always, because like we were discussing, ideas are non-rivalrous, right? The fact that I share some idea with you doesn't necessarily reduce either of our abilities to continue to take value or derive value from an idea.
Yeah.
So what happens is that anybody investing in an R&D, even if at the firm level, at that individual level, they're not able to actually go through the full benefits and gains from that R&D investment, the society overall benefits.
Okay.
Right? So there is a positive externality that knowledge spillovers, knowledge investments have. And that's the second one, right? And the third that they talk about is that they have a paper called The Inverse U, where they say too low competition and the incumbents get very, very complacent.
Okay.
Correct? They are monopolistic, they can charge high. Why would they innovate and invest in R&D when everything's hunky-dory for them? But at the other end, if they have too much competition, then they're so squeezed out of their own profit margins that they're not investing in R&D for the long term.
Okay.
So their work actually concludes that intermediate levels of competition, where things are more neck to neck, where it's competable but not too far away, that's that Goldilocks zone that leads to high R&D investment. A small caveat here, this has been proven wrong in some scenarios, and this theory actually has some critics. For example, what I'm curious about is how does this explain China's growth in so many sectors, right? Because China has huge competition. It's actually called Hunger Games capitalism, the brutal competition that domestic firms and private sector in China faces. And yet China in so many sectors like electric vehicles and so on and so forth has actually become world-beating. So what does that then talk about levels of competition? I don't yet know. But this paper specifically says that intermediate levels of competition actually lead to high R&D investment. So I think that's another key insight in terms of their work.
Okay. That was quite descriptive. Also, to understand these papers, like we are living through this period of like AI revolution and how AI will impact daily lives, jobs, and so many other things. Climate change discussions, like how can probably better investment or better technology in that play out over time, and of course the trade wars between the multiple powers which are coming. So how relevant is this, probably 50, 60, 70-year-old questions about industrial revolution to today's economy, in at least in the global level or in these major significant economies?
Yeah. So firstly, both this work is from the 1990s, so at least 30 years ago, right? But I would say they're quite relevant because some of these things about how incentives for incumbents and new players and R&D investment and what that means for overall economic growth, there are key questions here for policymakers today. Firstly, there is a need for a balancing act between R&D support, patent policies, antitrust competition, the level of competition in a sector. All of these affect the incentive for R&D. At the same time, policymakers can't let a few unproductive firms take over monopolistically because, again, that, like we saw in the case of even the Industrial Revolution, actually is a bad thing. So flexibility and change and being open in terms of our culture to adopt technology, to tinker with technology is important. And I think this has a few other consequences, right? If we need this sustained economic growth, we have to also accept the churn, the firm exit rates, the job destruction that follows with that. And again, for policymakers, this might have implications in terms of social mobility, unemployment benefits, but also the fact that because innovation will always come from the outside, these outsiders must have opportunities, access, capital, etc., to innovate, right? So I think that's at the ecosystem level. But I think specifically to AI, we also need, for example, if Mokyr's work on the culture is any marker, his work has actually been cited to talk about how it's the embodiment of AI inventions in multiple sectors, in processes, in organizations, how that actually matters more than the invention of AI alone. So it's diffusion at the end of the day, right? And the culture to be open to some of these things, and the institutions to support it, and the institutions to support this technology adoption, as well as compensating people who may have lost out from the benefits of some of these things. So it's that cultural ethos that's important, I think, as a takeaway for today's times.
Nice. Of course, no Nobel Prize is there, or no research paper out there is without any debate. So, can we also delve into some of the criticisms or probably controversies which would have come up with respect to this topic? Because since there is a certain qualitative analysis and subjective orientation to all of this, it can't be completely universal, which leads to other thinkers or economists coming out with their own arguments with respect to this. So, can we look into that?
Yeah. So, I think one criticism that really struck me was for Mokyr's work, which is that this is about ideas that sound legit, but they can't be validated or proven or tested in a way that's rigorous and actually passes econometric tests. So I think that's one, that this is ideas that's not necessarily... and firstly, Mokyr is an economic historian, and he's... a historian more than an economist, so that, this is not actually the direction in which a few economists wanted the Nobel Prize to go. Right? I think that's one. And the second is the politics of it, right? Because another thing that struck me was that, yes, the Peace Prize is extremely political, but actually it turns out even the economics prizes, because Mokyr has spoken about how impediments to the open exchange of ideas, for the fading support for science and funding for science, could pose future threats to economic growth. And actually, Phillipe Aghion is closely associated with French President Macron's economic reforms, and he has criticized the US protectionist policies. So this seems to be also, in some way, the Nobel Committee's stance against national interest economics and trying to push for more open exchange of ideas, etc., right? In any case, if you look at the 2024 Economic Nobel Prize, it went to this person, Darren Acemoglu, who has, over 2 lakh citations, who has an H index of 175, which means that 175 papers each with more than 175 citations. So an absolute beast in productivity in racking up papers at a rate faster than most people can even read some of these papers, right? And if you look at even published articles in econ in the top 5 journals between 2005 to 2010, his name is actually center. It pops up, right? So in any case, the Economics Nobel Prize is more about influence and not necessarily about the ability to prove some of these ideas, going back to Mokyr's work and the criticism there. But again, like we were discussing, prior to this podcast, the fact that Mokyr won this Nobel Prize is actually a vindication to his own work, that ideas and culture matter, right? So I think there's a beautiful, poignant lesson in there.
Right. And it also focuses that there is a certain importance that has to be given to these qualitative parameters, variables and features, which do have an influence in such a diverse societies across the globe itself. Okay, that was an interesting discussion. And also to probably go into a last question, that as we discuss in these policy levels, what would be a few key takeaways for India in general with respect to these papers and these concepts and ideas?
Yeah. So I think what we were speaking about in terms of lessons for policymakers and trying to balance R&D subsidies, patent policy, intellectual property rights, antitrust, competition, all of these are important lessons for India as well. But I think particularly what struck me was, this epistemic pace that the Enlightenment, the culture of experimentation, the culture of tinkering, the sufficient base for science and industrial focus that Mokyr's work actually said is very, very important as a foundation for, growth, but firstly, technological innovations to come through. And maybe for us to ponder if we have enough of this, because our open source contributions are low. So clearly we're not tinkering enough if you go by that one metric. If you look at R&D spends by all kinds of firms, not enough. If you look at, how many MSMEs we have versus really large oligopolies in pretty much every sector, I think that also brings some question as to, are large companies complacent? Are they innovating enough? Things like that. So I think there is definitely a lesson in there about how innovation could perhaps help and contribute to overall economic progress that would finally lead to prosperity of our people. And maybe that's, I don't have full answers, but I think there may be a lesson there for our viewers to listen into and ponder upon.
Right. Thank you so much, Shobhankita. That was an insightful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Swathi.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.